Thank you all for coming. I'm thrilled to be here and to welcome you all, as well as Camille Norment, Seth Cluett, and James Hoff, in conversation on the occasion of the launch of the publication Plexus, which, of course, is the eponymous book or catalog in relation to the Commission on View here at DHLC, curated by Kelly Keeveland, who is actually in the audience with us, visiting from the Wexner Art Center, where she's now chief curator. And I also want to, of course, convey my immense gratitude for Sevilla Lyragakis, who is the editor of the publication, along with Kelly, and many others who have made this publication possible. And so perhaps maybe just to get started, we can talk a little bit about why we thought it was so important to actually pass the physical book around while we're talking about it. Because, the exhibition itself, as you might have already experienced, is so much about different ways of engaging the materiality of sound. And the book itself is so haptic and has such a material dimension, and the way in which touch and tactility relate to its unfolding are very essential, I think, to its conception. So maybe we could just start there and talk a little bit about that.
Anyone in particular?
Well, I just want to add a question, which is, everyone will be seeing the book, which is incredibly beautiful, and I just had a question about how the concept for the book came about and how that process went. So, if you don't mind speaking to that, would be great.
Okay, I think that's they're both a good question, and they are intertwined. Can everyone hear me well enough? Okay, great. I think I will back up even one step further and talk about this space itself, which, if you look to the center column, is equipped with two turntables, a set of books on one side, and an artwork by Max Neuhaus on the other. And so this is part of what I consider as the sort of a constellation series that is really focusing on investigating or making available and accessible various contexts around certain thematics that the artwork is dealing with. It's not at all an attempt to imply meaning, but it's really parallel conversations. So given that, a previous publication that I had for Rapture, which is also available in the bookstore here, was similarly engaged. My presence is only there in the form of a conversation, similar to this publication here. And I asked specifically all of the contributors with essays to not mention the artwork or even my name at all. That was part of the deal. Everyone was pretty good except for one, dear Greg Tate, who I wish were with us now, but he is the one who actually couldn't resist but to make a more direct connection. And actually, I'm very grateful for that now. But so when considering the publication for this exhibition, that was a precedent. What form would the contextualization, take, and how could I move that a little bit further in one direction or the other? So in this case, some of the essays were more direct in referencing my work and myself, and certainly the issues in this piece. So I thought, well, how could we work with the actual physicality of the pages? The tactility of sound, which is so important. The relationship that the body of the viewer has in creating the work and creating experience that is so important to the work. So, thinking of, this is not something that could be fully fulfilled on a screen, for example. You have to hold it in your hand. You have to turn the pages and struggle to see the text. But in that struggling, what you're seeing is, the layers of the skin in conversation with each other, just like the layering of the sound spectrum is in conversation of each other. You can take any sound and strip it down to singular frequencies, and focus in, but then you're losing the sound body itself. So this is in printing on vellum. It was a thought of trying to sort of capture that possibility of moving inwards and outwards to something that was very specific, like the words on a page, which has specific meaning, is communicating something very direct, to the seeing of text emerging through the image, that's in front of it, and what kind of conversations are created in that sort of haphazard touching.
I also wanted to add, I was reading this on the subway, and so I guess the other thing is, maybe it's a hack or it's a feature, I'm not sure, but is being able to take the end pages and slipping them into the vellum so you can read it with a white background. And so I was on the subway and I just kept turning it, and then every page I'd have to redo it, and it was a pretty incredible experience in a way, because it activates the reader. It forces the reader to be activated in a way that a lot of books don't, and in a way that also reminds me, you're very aware that you're actively engaging with the book, obviously, because you have to keep taking the pages in and out. But you're also very aware. It's a very physical experience, which is something that I think with most books, or a lot of books, that's an awareness that you lose as you lose yourself in the material. And that to me made quite an impression. I think that was intentional with the end papers. Is it correct? Okay, great. But it also reminded me a lot of the actual installation, and also the haptic experience of that. And also it makes you very aware. You can lose yourself in it, but you're also very aware of your own presence inside of it.
Yes. No, thank you. And I think the choreography, well, just to briefly respond, I know we have limited time, but I mean, it's in a way, it's, how do we create various choreographies in a way as well. I think about, I have a background as a dancer, and so I'm very occupied with the movement of bodies and spaces, and so I bring that to installations, and this was also, how could I bring that to a book in a way? I mean, for me, I find it very difficult to read unless I have a pencil in my hand, not a pen, but a pencil specifically, because I'm a scribbler. I write in the columns, I underline, but I don't want the permanency. I want, I want, something that I feel that, I don't know why, it's this insecurity, but, highlighters, no, pens, no, but a pencil, to leave the trace of thoughts, but it's creating this loop, this kind of feedback loop, I think, to have that kind of interaction or the possibility of it, just reading, activating the eyes, but my body is also just ready to jump in as well, and create that circuit, complete that circuit in a way. So I think the activity that you're talking about is part of that. But Seth, you brought some interesting books here as well. And
yeah, I just want to draw one connection actually between things that you said, which is that, there's something about the act of reading this book with this format that brings the body into the reading act. And this is a direct parallel to your work, right? Like, one of the things that I find remarkable about your practice is no matter how material, no matter how precious some parts are and how ephemeral other parts are, there's always an awareness of I become more aware of my bodily presence in the context of that work. And I think there's something about not just the physicality of folding in the thing and being able to see the reading, and then having wanted to do the next page and doing it, and having this hand choreography that's engaging your body. But there's also this idea of the transparency giving you access to what's to come that makes the reading of the book a time-based act more so even than the linearity of the time-based act of reading is generally, which I think is a quite beautiful
that's
thing.
very nice.
Yeah, but Camille pointed out that I have a couple of books in front of me, and one of the things that I do as part of my art practice is the indexing and archiving of histories of sound, and one of those things involves books that try to reflect sound in one way or another that's more than just the book, more than just the text. And one of the things that I love is this amazing exhibition from the Vit to Vit called Voices from the 80s, that you can see very easily from here that there's a hole in the center of the book. And if I kind of pull apart, this is a book about the voice that's managed to figure out a way to cut a hole through every page of the book until you have a vocal cord running its way through the book, which has this other fascinating aspect, which as you're turning the pages of the book, there are absences in the page that force you into a particular way of reading that's particularly interesting. There's terribly boring ways of presenting sound work, which, the whole history of sound exhibition catalogs is basically like an image and a text, and usually an image from the artist from before the thing was installed, which means you don't get an accurate picture of what the thing actually was. But many of these things try to find a way to actually engage the body. So the other one I'll show quickly before we go on is this exhibition from the Caja Madrid that has in the cover a little tab, and if you pull it, sorry, the battery is dead, but it plays a Robert Henke piece from a chip built into the cover of the book. So there's always this attempt in a lot of books that deal with sound literature, particularly, to try to give people access to some of the experience of the ephemerality of sound, no matter how conceptual or abstract the process might be. So, I think this book just does a wonderful job of that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I thought maybe it could be interesting to talk a little bit about this in relationship to the max feed that's on view in this space that sort of was the generator of the context and constellations, if you will, and in many ways sort of the impetus for Plexus in a way, and sort of your relationship with Dia, beginning with an artist-on-artist lecture on Max Neuhaus. Because it's interesting, I'm thinking about the Max feed as this portable sort of feedback instrument, and also the way in which it was conceived as a multiple, in a way sort of like a printed object of sound to be used as an instrument, and of course relating so much to this democracy and possibility of feedback being something used as a distributed mode of agency in a way. And perhaps maybe you could speak to that, Camille, and or maybe even James, I'd be curious to hear about that sort of sensibility as it relates sort of to the mission of even primary information.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I mean, Primary Information is a press that I co-founded in 2006 with Miriam Katzoff and have been running for the last 15 years, is devoted to artist books and the sort of idea that comes out of the 60s from people like Lucy Lippard and Dick Higgins and Seth Cluett and others, that the book could actually function as a vehicle for the distribution of artworks, and they could be sold cheaply. It could be a democratic form, sort of riding on the tail end of the first paperback revolution, and thinking about the book as this vehicle or exhibition space that could travel out into the world. So a lot of practitioners doing that in the 60s. A million examples of that across the street right now for the fair. And it's interesting because the Max feed comes out in the middle of that renaissance, and which is also, I mean, I'm kind of curious about the Max feed in a way in terms of it as a multiple, but also in terms of like the more functional aspects. Like I kind of wonder how many were actually produced. We should add, I guess, that the work it's not working right now, right? The Max feed. So I'm curious if there are any in the world that are actually working. I know we don't know the answers to this, but these are the questions that come up. And yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about it in those ways. Do you think about the book as like a way of, because it does function so well as an art object, as an object in and of itself, and do you think of it in the same way? Like, do you think of it as a distributed work that's an extension or something in parallel? Or
I think that now that I have it in my hands and it exists, I do, because I think that also, especially because of the activity that might be necessary to actually read through an essay, I think abstracts that reading process in a way that I find positive. So, for example, you might open it and land on a page because it appeals to you in a different, way the pages connect to each other at that moment, and perhaps read a few lines and then open to another page and read another few lines. And so I think that more abstracted poetic reading through the work becomes, through the book becomes an artwork in itself, and it does deconstruct this sort of assumed linearity of reading, and that wasn't That in particular wasn't pre-planned because we didn't really know what we would get. I mean, I knew I wanted vellum, I wanted this sort of semi-transparency, but how well the ink would hold on the page, how saturated would the colors be, how would the image actually look and feel like an image or something that was just kind of floating on the surface that you could scratch away with your nails. I mean, all of these things we didn't know, and so we're really happy with the way that it turned out because it's very cohesive in that very technical way, which was important. And so those details do not become distractions, but they become encouragements to read a little bit differently. Just open up to a page because you find it beautiful. You think, oh wow, look at the text coming through this golden whatever that object is, and read a few words. And I personally find that very opening. It creates a new set of possibilities.
I think that was like one of the follow-up questions I wanted to ask, and it's a bit of a tricky one. I think I know the answer to this, but I just feel like I should ask, which is, particularly in relationship to the max feed, which isn't working, it just becomes an object. And how do you feel about the book if people don't read it, like if they only appreciate it as an object?
It's, like once it's out there, it's out there. I have no expectations. I don't offer instructions. I'm as curious as the next person. So it's not going to say that I don't care. I mean, I think there's a lot of information in there, but it will be absorbed in one way or the other. And I think that even by piecing together abstract phrases here and there, you might even get the same message that you would in reading every essay from beginning to end. And that is how I approach, that is my end desire for the artworks that I create, that it would have the possibility of getting to the similar message space that encouraged me to make an artwork in the beginning without having to come away with the details, yeah.
I really like how open-ended the publication is in a way, because it doesn't, I mean, you can tackle it from many different angles in terms of how you use the book or how you approach the book, which I think is a great success in a way, because I know as a book producer it's very hard to actually do that. So to be able to create a book that can function both like on a tactile level as an object, but also as like a vehicle of information, like all those things are kind of hard to pull off, and that's to say nothing of the actual production of producing an entire book on Mylar, which I know is not easy to do. We've produced a few books that have a few Mylar pages in them, and it's been pretty tough. So,
yeah, I'd like to sort of open this up a bit and ask a question of both of you regarding like art books. There's this interesting thing that happens where like they're made to be read, and then they live for time, and then they become sort of calcified, and people treat them as now new art objects rather than an art object that was meant to kind of democratize the access to art objects. So the max feed is a great example of this. There's no reason we can't open that thing up and fix it. Like there's really no reason. And we have the schematic, like I've got a soldering iron, like we can make this thing work.
can you actually fix it?
Yeah, I could fix it.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. Well, that's.
Yeah, well, we actually fired it up. And Randy, I don't know if Randy was, Randy, so I had the same question. I thought, okay, well, I'm sure we can get some sound out of this thing. Let's crank it up, So we did that, and we have wonderful videos of this experiment of trying to get it to speak to us, and it said something, I'm not sure.
So it sounds like an ego thing to say, oh, yeah, I could fix it, but the reality of things like that is that like someone like Max had this idea, like eschewed performance. He's like, no, the concert hall is not an okay place for me to do this. This needs to be things that people can experience, and I move myself, like people move themselves through the work, and that balances the playing field between proscenium stage and experience of sound. And I think max feed is a perfect extension of that, because it's this thing where you then, the owner of the thing, can turn your living room into the piece, and that the feedback, as is its nature, will adapt itself to the room.
Yes.
And that adaptation is your art for your space with this device. And so I think the same thing happens with your relationship to the book. Your mind makes sense out of the flow of pages and the succession of words and the structure of the way that the art book made it. So I'm just curious for both of you, like if this book were to become an art object in 70 years, there are only so many copies, and people were to buy it but not read it. It's an extension of James's question, but same with primary information, right? You make Avalanche and it's sitting out there, and you were just saying that's one of the last copies. It's way out of print. If someone just buys that, goes on a shelf, like is something lost?
Well, I should say for primary information, this was one of the problems that we set out to solve when we formed the organization, which I was working at Printed Matter for many years. And I would see all these great publications come in from the 60s that were originally meant to be sold for $5 or given away, and were being sold for $1,000 or $5,000. And there were publications that were not only dealing with like conceptual art or artist books, books as objects, but also dealing with art and activism and things that they seemed really important and really vital to be out in the world. And I had access to them because I had the privilege of working at Printed Matter, and others have access if they work at a university or they're close to a library, but most people don't. So for us, like Miriam and I, for Primary Information, the idea was one of the original ideas, one of the tenets of what we do is we publish facsimile editions of these books and put them back out into the world, and we sell them at cost. So we'll take a book that was made in the 60s and we'll reproduce it to spec, basically, and then we'll sell it for $10, $15, $20, maybe $30 in very large edition sizes, so 3,000, 4,000 copies, usually much bigger than what they originally published in, and distribute them throughout the world. And I would say that we've been pretty successful at doing that in terms of like revitalizing a lot of publications for people to access. But one of the things that we never really considered at the time was what happens when those publications sell out. Because as a nonprofit, we don't always have the money to reprint things. And so they eventually will become kind of rarefied objects. And if we can, we'll try to reprint them or get them back into the world. The other thing that we didn't take into account was that we boosted the value of those original publications that we are reproducing from, which is, I guess, fine, but an unintended consequence. But yeah, it is a shame for us when our publications go out of print and they become rarefied. Though they're usually still much cheaper than the other publications, and we also feel like, okay, well, we got like 3,000 more copies in the world, and we worked very hard to get them into collections. So we're hoping that they'll circulate in a slightly more efficient way than the originals, which isn't always the case. But how do you feel about that? Like if a publication goes out of print?
I think, the fetish of the object is unavoidable, and I can't spend too much time thinking. I mean, look at the show. I mean, I love objects too, but I also like to consider other spaces. It's a kind of a fluid or continuity, through the object and into the space. But for the book itself, I mean, I think, there will be a certain number of copies printed. It will at some point go out of print, and whatever will happen to it, it will either be forgotten or it will be squeezed between books on a shelf. But, I think about that moment, there's reading and then there's opening. Probably most of the art books that I have, I don't read them anymore if I ever read them, but I will open them a lot, open them, I land on a page, I see something, I might read a bit, or look at the pictures, or try to evoke a memory of what I read before, or what it's connected to in the world. And I would imagine the same, but maybe even a richer sort of opening experience, because when you open, you already have a very strong message. You see text literally coming through the image, and I mean, if that's not a direct metaphor for sort of embedded knowledge of art, I don't know what that is. And I think that's a very, for me, that's almost enough. It's like, okay, it's just, now you can put it back in between the books and, take that away from you. And, but, as I can imagine these things, but people will, who knows what they'll do? It's the same as, creating a live feedback installation. I can imagine how people might interact with the space, but I don't really know until I'm standing in the corner and watching, just observing what do people really do, what do they think, and that's when it becomes fulfilling for me, because I become a spectator too. So, I open the book and, I haven't read, I read it during the creation process, but, I don't know if I'll ever read it in that form, front to back, who knows, but I love opening the pages and landing on these sort of conversations and layers and trying to, what can I read here at this moment before putting in a flap? I think it's a wonderful, for me at least, I enjoy that as a mode of abstraction.
Yeah. So the discussion of sort of the non-functionality of the max feed makes me sort of think about how we initially thought about it as, how can we represent it and what would it do? And perhaps it's a visual signifier or maybe a register or an index to sort of its more performative moment or something like this, and that it was signaling feedback in some way. And thinking about, what you're saying about sort of the trace and sort of this sort of specter or even spectral dimension of what you were thinking about in relationship to how the book imbues a sonic sensibility. I'm curious for all of you around this notion of the index in relationship to sound, like what is left behind, like what is the possibility of sort of the archive in relationship to sound as it relates to the more physical sort of experience of the book or ephemera. And perhaps I'm curious to think about that in relationship to you, particularly Seth, and since you've amassed such a immense collection of books and ephemera as it relates to sound, but also all of you are live performers as well in some degree of your practice. And how do you think about that? How do you think about printed matter in relationship to the live event when you're sort of engaging it in that way?
Yeah. I mean, here we sit in the post-pandemic era having fresh memories of our performances being online for almost 2 years. So, that was something that actually had to get reconciled. Like I make pieces for people to understand what their body feels like in space situated in like green spaces in cities and the tension that makes. And for 2 years, that's just not a possibility. And so I think I felt like the max feed thing. It's like I'm broken. Like as an artist, I don't get to be me for a bit here. So what do those ideas look like in a space where you don't have access to the normal tools to express them? And I think we've all experienced that in one form or another. But I think, so they keep mentioning this archive that I keep, and the short version is like it's 350 something sound theme group catalogs and like maybe 500 individual artist catalogs, and then maybe 7,000 pieces of ephemera related to the history of exhibition of sound in the visual arts, which sounds like a lot, and it is. I have an office now at my job, so it stays there instead of my apartment, to my partner's happiness. Curators will come to the office, or a historian will come to the office, or you will come to the office, and we spread things out on the table, and we look, and it's like this big picture view of like, wow, in the 70s, they sure were interested in that. And in the 80s, they sure were interested in that. Why is it in every one of these catalogs from the early 90s, there's a CD stuck in the inside of the front cover that's scratched up because like they paid no attention to it. So there's all of this like strategies for people to try to claw their way towards like locking the ephemerality of sound into a form that can kind of represent the experience of the exhibition. And I think it's one of the things that this show has been a revelation for me. It's the first long-running sound installation show that I've had the opportunity to be in many times since the pandemic, and it's sort of like it's I don't want to sound like florally poetic, but it's like a symphony to putting your body back in space, and I'm constantly aware of that kind of interaction, and it does work that this book gets closer to than almost any other book in my whole collection, because it does work towards trying to capture the presence of the body in the artwork, which is something that gets so erased so often in documentation.
I was just going to say this is kind of an answer to your question, but what I love about sound in terms of putting sound into the world as a distributed object, as a record, a CD, an MP3, whatever it is. What I love about it is how uncontrollable it is. Like you like music has this capacity to self-distribute through a culture in a much different way than the visual arts do or books do. It's just a different thing, and that's what, as a producer, something I really love, and something I definitely don't ever try to control once it leaves my my domain. And I think at your last talk, you were talking a lot about feedback and being able to control feedback, and it's a very hard thing to control, as you know.
Yeah.
And I think of it not quite in the same way, but there's a parallel there to some extent.
Yeah. I think so too. I mean, well, not to sort of repeat that conversation, but I think yes, the fact that feedback is inherently uncontrollable, and yet we're always wanting to control it is fascinating for me. And when I came across the max feed that was really, I think finding the max feed was really why I chose Neuhaus. I was aware of him, and of course, there were two sort of sound artists, in the Dia collection, and I thought, I can't do a sound artist, that's too easy or obvious, but, I thought, Lamont Young might be the obvious choice, but let me do due diligence and, look a little bit more into Max Neuhaus. I knew a few pieces and, varying from, designing the sirens for New York, to Times Square, just, bits and pieces here and there, but the more I read, the more I just kind of fell in love in a way. But I was astonished. I really had no idea that this was happening, that he was producing this in 1967. And I was so, disappointed in my art history education, but also just, I felt very proud in a way. I thought, wow, we have been producing this, since 1967. This was a parallel conversation to the civil rights movement, that my parents were very active in, and to very similar ends, I thought, or I feel, talking about society and control and negotiations, conversations between, sonic beings and bodies and architectures, but between each other, How do we filter and control and direct conversations, and how can thinking about the world through feedback, for example, at least for me, sort of help to reshape my perspectives of how we deal with each other in some way, and again in a very abstract way, but I often feel like with this book it's the sort of far away so close strategy, sort of you go further away or become more abstracted, for me often gets closer to sort of an essence of something. So having the max feed here was very important in this kind of contextual or constellation library. And even if it wasn't working, for many reasons, I think we couldn't put it in the hands of the public and say, hey, just put it in the corner and make feedback, just because it is a precious object, but it belongs here, as something that is readable and understandable. It's part of the dialogue between, Eliane Radig album, for example, and I don't know, Rock My Religion, Dan Graham, and Max, so many things, so many, any combination of things that you could pick up in this space and put them together, I see having a very similar constellational conversation as the juxtaposition of pages, for example. And even though this is fixed, I think that just letting your eye land on the first three words and reading them and then closing the book, putting it away, can function in a very similar way.
It also calls to mind of this op-ed that Neuhaus wrote in the late 60s that was arguing against controlling. It was arguing for sound pollution, basically, and arguing against city ordinances that limited sound in certain capacities. And he's known for sound walks, like going through the city and taking people on sound walks to listen to the sounds of the urban environment. So it's a pretty great. It's in the Dia publication, correct? So it's a great one to read if anyone's interested.
On the note of sort of this uncontrollable dimension of feedback, we've talked a lot about the intersection of feedback and horror, and we've actually just added a new element to this Context and Constellations presentation, which is a mix or audio montage by James Hoff, and I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how this demonstrates what we were sort of talking about, especially as it relates to sort of feedback and agency in relationship to horror.
Well, I guess, yeah, we were having just a dinner like maybe a little over a year ago, and we just randomly were talking about the use of feedback in A Quiet Place. I think I'd just seen A Quiet Place 2, maybe. Does everyone know these films, these horror films? And just the way feedback is employed in that film, and then thinking through other examples in which feedback has been used in recent times as like a cinematic device that is used essentially to empower people in the horror film genre in particular to combat zombies and aliens and things like this. So yeah, so just in terms of discussing that, I stripped away a bunch of sound from scenes, different scenes mostly from A Quiet Place 2, and then a Korean zombie television show called We're All Gonna Die that came out last year. And so you can hear that at some point, I guess through the headphones, right?
Yeah,
interface.
those headphones right there.
So. So yeah, so it's interesting the way, because feedback's been used a lot in soundtracks and as part of a sound environment within films, but these are some newer examples of the way feedback's being used and deployed. I guess, yeah, as a plot device that's used to empower humans, and typically humans at a disadvantage are, in case of A Quiet Place, younger people, also in We're All Gonna Die. I think the students in this high school, they're trapped in high school, are using it as well. So I don't know, it's an interesting...
Yeah, it was a very, very exciting conversation. Also because I had previously been thinking about feedback in relationship to the state of alarm. If for those of you who have seen the Artist on Artist talk, I spoke about this correlation between the bell as a social communication tool, but that was very sort of the power to actually sonify it, was very limited. I mean, you had to have some social power, but except in the case of fire, that was when the average person in the town was allowed to run into the bell tower and, ring the bell. But they would also sneak in if the taxes suddenly were raised too high or if the price of bread went up. So this kind of, so state of alarm and then social protest, suddenly became a correlation, through the bell. And I don't want to re-give this lecture, but, so the bell and the feedback were correlated also through Max Neuhaus and notions of sort of the body and power. So this idea of sort of fire, as a state of alarm, but also a state of empowerment. You think of the solar plexus. This is the heat center of our bodies. It's generating. It is the fire of individual bodies, and so that's an incredibly positive thing. But we know fire is a destructive force, but it's also a regenerating force as well in nature. The forests that are burned down. They're rich in nutrients to live again over time. So it's the next month we have a performance as well that will be a bit more actively engaging these ideas of feedback and fire, and I don't want to give it all away, but I'm looking forward to it. But it's great. I'm so excited that both James and Seth were very important contributors to this sort of constellation series that we have here. So please, if you haven't engaged in it yet, do so.
I'm curious to talk a little bit about the relationship between the individual experience and the collective experience as it's sort of functioning in different modalities here at DHLC, but also between the book and sort of the exhibition experience. You've talked a lot about the bell as a summoning, and also you've created this sort of communal space where people, are very aware how their bodies are interacting with the space collectively, and are seeing each other interact, especially with sort of the wooden benches or structures, and sort of there's this almost horizontality in which people are really brought together, if you will. And I'm curious if when we talked about programming this space, there were some logistical reasons why, of course, it's not ambient sound, but also there was an intentionality of perhaps having a different mode of listening, like that of using headphones and the individual experience versus a more ambient or sort of collective way of experiencing sound. And maybe sort of think a little bit about how that translates to the book, which is, one could say for the most part, something that one experiences alone or in an more intimate or private way, unless it's being rehearsed or performed in a more collective way. But I guess, yeah, these are some of the tensions that I'm curious about, and sort of your intentionalities or hopes for these different modes of engagement.
Yes. No. I think, that's a great question. I think it is a very intimate and individual experience, readily. But one could also imagine, reading out loud, perhaps. What would it take for it to become a collective experience? I'm not sure. I haven't thought of it so much in relationship to the book, but I can imagine, and everyone opens up to something and then just reads the first 5 words that come to mind and sort of passing around. What kind of knowledge is created in that kind of shared fragmentation? I think could be very interesting. We could do it here today, and I think come away with a whole great lecture. Actually. So that's I think that could be interesting.
All right, everybody, open up your book.
Is it paginated?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, actually, no, I don't think we have page numbers. Do we have numbers? I don't know. Oh, yeah, there are numbers, yeah. But, and these are things that you don't know until it exists. It's like the, sort of thinking you understand a child before it's born. Then, you can come up with a name, but you don't know, the personality, even in something that is not fully formed, until it's existing in the world. So I think I'm just discovering all sorts of relationships to have with the book now. Yeah.
I think there's something, actually, Jordan, that you bring up that is super interesting in the context of Camille's work, and also this space as part of the exhibition, which is that, there's all of this discourse in sound studies around the loudspeaker and what its potentials are. And so some of it is like the phone, where you've got one-to-one communication. You've got public address systems, which is one-to-many communications. And then you've got the radio in the 20s, 30s, which was one to a few people in a living room or one to a couple people in a car. There's these, there's the aspect of transmission, and then there's the technology of reproduction, and then there's the energy between communicating forces, right? So one of the things that's been interesting about this room is that whenever you come in, there might be 3 people with the headphones on, lying on beanbags. And the headphones are Bluetooth headphones, which means they're just sitting around the room with the headphones on. And the first time, I had this vivid, super vivid imagination of what they were all listening to. So I went over the record player. I'm like, oh, what are they listening to? The first time, actually, I picked up the needle. I was like, someone left the record player on, and I picked it up, and I just hadn't seen them. They were occluded by the pillar. They were like, hey, what's going on? But this idea of people listening together, there's the silent disco thing where people all listen to the same track on headphones. But in here, it was simultaneous plurality of shared space of inhabitation with disparate, individualized listening choices, which I think that is active in the work too. It's you are sitting and you feel the sound of the singers through your body. You are walking and you don't notice that you can go around a thing. There's aspects of that. So I'm just curious, for you, to what extent is that idea of simultaneous difference important in the context of people's experience of your work?
Very important, I'd say, in that I assume there will be a difference, and because there are always things that cannot be anticipated, I think, and everyone brings, when I think of bodies, bodies are experienced, so that's already constitutes a difference, so everyone will come to the piece through their own experience, and receive it differently. And, some will come away, feeling joyful, others mournful, some meditative, some will return, some will never come back again. I mean, I've heard, all of these, above. And that, I think, speaks more towards being able to address the inherent individuality of people through the memory of their bodies and their experiences than actively trying to point to that myself, I think.
I think that's a beautiful place to open it up to questions. But before I do want to acknowledge and thank our visionary designer, Laura Fields, who collaborated with Camille on this amazing publication. And yes, are there any questions in the audience?
There's one in the back.
In the back? Oh, one moment, the mic is here.
Sorry, I feel like the conversation about documentation is also kind of a glancing conversation about control as well. So I'm wondering, too, how you feel about engaging in forms of documentation for time-based or experiential works that actually makes people more conscious of their absence from it, rather than trying to sort of mimic presence.
That's a great question, and I'm constantly, plagued by documentation for that very reason. Especially now with this, the video and everything goes straight to the internet. It drives me crazy, simply because it gives people a sense that, oh yeah, I saw the video, I get it, I understand, and of course they didn't, but this has become a norm, this sort of hovering or bouncing on a surface of something has become so acceptable that it really defies and undermines even, I think, attempts to even understand that there's so much that is being missed. So I think, again, far away, so close. How can abstracted means have a more powerful way of creating the message than trying to capture the video itself and the perfect sound? I mean, of course, now the closer we come towards the end, I'm starting to get nervous, like, oh, do we have enough video? Do we have the perfect sound? Because, I feel, it's, I'm going to lose it soon. But even so, as you're saying, I'm thinking more in terms of, the image and maybe, 12 seconds of sound, this kind of thing. What kind of juxtapositions, and enough of these sort of fragments, again, I'm very into the fragmentation, because the negative space, we know, is so important. You think of a composition, good compositions are very conscious of the negative space, and they have so much power because they're quiet and we don't really think they're there. But it's the negative space in documentation also that has the similar kind of agency and power. So I think, I hope I'm able to continue. I think this book is one way of addressing that for me, and encouraging abstraction also. And but we'll see what the rest is like after we do it.
I actually have one last question that you just kind of prompted with that, which is, there's an element of the piece in which there's this static of the bell piece, or in the first gallery, where there's this static that you can hear, this spectral sort of static. If you get very close to the piece, it becomes sort of intelligible. And that's sort of pulled from, these various 60s, 70s broadcasts around resists or protests, environmental, political, social, otherwise. So this notion of static, and you were talking about negative space, and I'm just like, for some reason that sort of elicited me thinking about static in relationship to your conversations around feedback and sort of how you're dealing with moments of sort of spectral presence or moments of negative space, and other moments of much more thickness or visual density, both sonically and spatially in the page, if you will.
Well, the static that you are referring to is, many might not have even noticed it's there. You hear this kind of, very faint It sounds very science fictional, I think, when you're close to the object itself in the first room. I took that from radio programs with the content that you were discussing, and I removed all the voices and just left the moments of static in between. So I played those discussions, about this sort of fires, and riots, and civil rights protests, but I removed the actual content again to just have the static in between. So this is something that unless you have no way of knowing that just listening to the sound. You might not even recognize the sound as static. So it's a very conceptual element, but somehow I feel once placing it in the object and hearing it, and how does this actually function, as a sound object? What is it actually doing? It had this kind of broken communication. I mean, it sounded like it could be, somebody, talking on just the static of a walkie-talkie, or some kind of, science fiction, use of, the astronauts talking to each other. It had this references to time and attempted communication, between bodies over distances. And I thought, okay, that's enough. I think that's enough, especially in this context of the feedback. And it's not important that anyone knows that they're from, the radio broadcasts about riots or civil rights protests at all. It's this, attempted communication, this broken, the apparatus that it's attempting to reach, beyond and across to whomever, whatever, of some time, physical or time space.
Alrighty then. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank Camille, of course, and Seth and James for this amazing conversation. Camille has actually generously agreed to sign some copies of Plexus outside by the admissions desk for any of those who want to grab a copy and sort of get your fetish object version. But no, really, in all seriousness, I would take the opportunity. Anyway, thank you so much already.